Welcome back, everybody. In this video, we are going to take a step back from the modeling we've been doing in the previous couple of videos, and we are going to discuss a method of texturing from within Maya called the 3D Paint tool. So let's go ahead and set up a scene real fast. I'm going to make a sphere. Going to assign a material. It's important that you don't work with the basic material for the sphere. You want to assign an actual new material for yourself. And we're all set up. So now you have to actually enter the 3D Paint tool itself. The material is not the 3D Paint tool. This is just the canvas on which we will be utilizing the 3D Paint tool. So now that we have applied an actual material to our sphere, we need to actually select our sphere and open up the 3D Paint tool. The main way of doing that is by heading up here to texturing, but you may notice that you don't have texturing. If you don't see texturing up here, it's possible that you are still in the modeling submenu from previous videos that we've been making use of, with mesh display, mesh tools, edit mesh. All that useful stuff is here in the modeling subset menu. You want to change this to the rendering subset menu in order to see texturing. Select texturing, and the first option is the 3D Paint tool. We're going to select the settings of the 3D Paint tool. Important to note, by the way, you want to make sure the object that you are going to be using the 3D Paint tool on is selected. So make sure with the object selected, you go to texturing, 3D Paint tool, settings, open it up, and now we're ready to start working, almost. You will notice if we take our brush and move it over the sphere, we currently have this X on it, and when we press, any mouse buttons, nothing is going to happen. It says down there, warning, some surfaces have no file texture assigned to the current attribute. So we have to assign a file texture so we can actually, create a texture for ourselves. The way to do that, with the tool settings open here, we're going to navigate down to where it says File Textures. We're going to select Assign and Edit Textures. We can attribute multiple kinds of texture files here. We have the basic color texture. We have a bump map texture. We've discussed what bump maps are in week 5. We have diffuse, displacement, incandescence, translucence, and transparency. Mainly, if you're going to be using the 3D Paint tool, you're probably going to be using color or bump map. In this case, we're going to be using color. So I'm going to have color selected. I'm going to go and select Assign/Edit Textures. And now we can assign a file size for our textures. It's currently set to 1K, 1024 by 1024. If you have the capabilities of pushing it higher, I would recommend you do so. So I'm going to set it to 2048 by 2048. I have keep aspect ratio on, so if I change this to any value like 512, then the Y will also change to 512. In this case, I am going to push and I'm going to make it 2048 by 2048. Image format, we can choose all kinds of images here. We discussed before that the textures come in all different kinds of image types. JPEGs, PNGs, Targas are in here somewhere. Yeah, there's Targas. TGAs are in there as well. Most commonly, you're probably going to be using PNGs for textures, so I would select that. You can also select JPEGs if you want to, but PNGs are the most common format, so we're going to select PNG. And we're not going to mess with anything else because we can't actually mess with anything else, so we're just going to assign/edit the texture, and there we go. A texture file has been assigned. With our texture file created, we can now go ahead and start actually painting on this properly. So let's go over some useful shortcuts real fast. We're working with a brush, so once again, you can hold B on your keyboard and the left mouse button to increase or decrease the size of your brush. You can also do it from up here in the brush settings. You can increase or decrease the size from there. We have options of color and flooding. In this case, I'm going to pick a color here. Let's go ahead and go with green here so we can see what we're doing. And if I start painting, nothing is going to happen. That is because if we go down to paint operations, you'll notice that I have erase selected currently. So I'm going to just put this over onto paint, and now, there we go. Nice green. We can select a different kind of brush, like this square brush here, if you wanted to use it for whatever reason. This, I believe, uses an actual image file, which we're not going to mess with right now, but you can if you wanted to. I believe you can use the file browser for shape profiles if you wanted to, but in this case, it's just going to be still that same circle since I don't have any images that I'm using for a brush. And we have flood options here. Let's go ahead and change this to the color yellow, and we'll flood the paint. There we go. Now I can change my operation to the erase instead of painting. And now we can start seeing the blue underneath. You can play around with the opacity of the flood as well if you wanted to. We have other options here, including smearing. You'll notice that line. That's because that's a seam right there. That's why it's not acting naturally there. 3D Paint Tool does rely on whatever UVs the primitive or object you're working with has, which is, again, a topic we also went over in week 5. We have blur here with a blur intensity. Cloning, but this is really something you would do more with, I think, an image brush than you would with just basic colors. And in fact, we can't even do anything. We have this X currently right now. So it's a little rudimentary, but this is how the 3D Paint tool works. You are basically creating your own basic texture files here. If you wanted to create a second texture file, you would have to go to Attribute to Paint, and you would have to change it over to something else, like say a bump map. And then you would have to assign and edit textures, just like you did for the color. We would, again, probably make it the same file size, and say assign edit attributes. And now I can play around with the bump of this. And of course, we know from week 5 that with bumps, you're only working with black or white. And I'll add a little bit more color just so that we can see what this is actually doing in terms of the files that we are creating. So I'll just add some basic color there. And there we go. So the files that were created in order to allow us to paint, color, and bump information onto the sphere will not actually show up until we save the scene. I'm going to minimize, find my project folder. I'm going to go into, is it images? Nope, that is where my saved renders go. Source images. Here we go, 3D Paint textures. My week 7 3D Paint test, which is, of course, what I called this scene. Open this up, and we can see the texture files that we created here for the sphere. This is the color file that we created with the little bit of orange that I have there. And this is the bump file, where I have the white there for the bit of the sphere that pops out, and the black for the bit of the sphere that recedes in. And these are files that you can now take into, say, Photoshop or GIMP or some other program and continue working on them from there if you wanted to. Or continue working on them from Maya directly with the 3D Paint tool. In this demo, you will see me use image planes, you'll see me do some minor component modeling, you'll see me alter the UVs of this orange a little bit, and you will see me employ a new kind of bump map. The bump map in question is right here. It is the fractal bump map. So instead of using a file that I got from the internet or that I created myself from Photoshop or GIMP, I am using Maya's built-in fractals to create the necessary bumps that signify an orange. And here it is, my quote-unquote orange. It's not that fantastic, but then again, the 3D Paint tool, I wouldn't consider it the most sophisticated texturing tool at your disposal. Honestly, collecting images and carefully laying out the UVs for those images to be laid on top of makes a lot more sense in my mind, or using dedicated texturing programs like Substance Painter. In fact, however, we did create our own texture here. So let's actually go ahead and open up the UVs for a second. So we can actually see the texture laid out here. And we can actually see what we've done in effect. We are capable of painting our own textures in Maya via the 3D Paint tool. Again, not what I would consider the most sophisticated method of doing this, but it is an option available to you nonetheless. So here is my orange, or I guess maybe grapefruit at this point. Regardless, here it is. This was a brief demo on how to use the 3D Paint tool. I hope you enjoyed. See you all next time. Bye-bye.